Crosby.
Deputy Speaker, this morning the world learned that a second American journalist had been murdered in the civil war in Iraq. It was met with international outrage. It's understandable that citizens of other countries attend their view to an atrocity when it touches one of our own, but this does not overshadow the more than 5,000 Iraqis who've been slaughtered, or the 12,000 who've been wounded, enslaved, abused and otherwise had their lives cut short at the hands of the murderous criminals who are masquerading as a cause. The United Nations has reported ISIS and its allies have committed systematic and egregious violations against civilians, including mass killings, sexual violence, kidnapping, destruction of property and attacks on places of religious worship and of great historical importance. These must be resisted. Deputy Speaker, to deploy Australian forces to another country to engage in operations of a theatre of war is probably one of the gravest decisions that any country can make. I believe it's proper that these decisions are made by governments who necessarily have the information and the intelligence at their fingertips and who are ultimately responsible for the consequences of their decisions. That does not mean that Parliament doesn't have a role. It's equally proper that the Australian people are engaged in this debate and through their representatives here in Parliament can express their views. Speaker, accordingly, in his address to Parliament this week, our leader, Bill Shorten, committed Labor's support to the government based on the following three principles. The first was responding effectively to the humanitarian crisis in Iraq to prevent genocide and relieve suffering. The second was promoting a unity government in Iraq that is inclusive and can achieve national cohesion, a government that would reject sectarianism and the alienation of minorities, enabling effective security and control of Iraqi territory. He said that we must not act in a way that would leave Iraq in a worse position. The third principle was to deny motivation and opportunity for Australian fighters to join with the ISIS forces in Iraq. This statement enjoys my full support and the full support of every Labor member of the House of Representatives. This morning, Deputy Speaker, it was reported that the Foreign Minister has said that this support is in face of the gritted teeth from Labor's left. I don't know if these comments are true, but if they are accurately reported, they're both unfortunate and ill-informed. It may suit the political objectives of one side of politics or another to pick a fight on the issue, but it's not in the long-term interests of an informed debate, and it's certainly not in the public interest. I've never felt more strongly about the importance of the need to confront the barbarity of ISIS and for Australia to play its part. This is not an issue of right versus left. This is an issue of right versus wrong. And to those who may question why the left of Australian politics should support this proposition, I simply say this: it's consistent with our values and our history. On the left, we believe in the fundamental equality of all humankind, of the dignity of humanity, and the solidarity with those who face imminent persecution. These beliefs must dictate our action. We cannot stand idly by. How can we call for a regional solution to the flow of refugees within our region and at the same time shrink from an in-country solution to the persecution that drives refugees into camps and refugees into boats that meet our shores? It simply does not make sense. It is also consistent with our long and proud history of being on the right side of these matters. It was John Curtin who famously turned to the United States and through that alliance in fighting the Pacific War in our nation's darkest hour, forged an alliance which has continued over 60 years and stands us in good stead today. It was the actions of a Labor government that gave birth to that alliance. It's also important that we contemplate the circumstances of John Curtin himself. He didn't enter the national political fray as the member for Fremantle or Australia's greatest wartime Prime Minister. He actually entered national politics as an anti-war and anti-conscription activist 25 years earlier. But he was an absolute fervent critic of the European slaughter, but he was also fervently opposed to the conscription of that early decades of our nation's federation. He was actually jailed for his anti-war and anti-conscription beliefs. But for 25 years later, he put the interests of the nation first and ensuring that we were well prepared to meet the onslaught of the Japanese Imperial Army. And it's the legacy of John Curtin which informs the actions of Australian Labor and should inform the position of the left of Australian politics when you contemplate the challenge that's before us today. Deputy Speaker, some say we shouldn't go down this direction, there must be an alternative. Some have argued that we should look to the alternatives, and that is indeed right. It's the right question to ask, but it's hard to fathom how the alternatives will halt the slaughter. If I honestly thought that a boycott, a protest, a sanction or a prayer group was going to stop the mass genocide and slaughter of minorities in northern Iraq and throughout the Middle East that is going on today, then I'd agree. Let's use the alternatives. But I don't think anybody who stands in this parliament today can honestly suggest that those actions are going to be sufficient. Many have pointed to the disastrous 2003 war in Iraq as a dangerous precedent that we need not follow. Well, I agree with them. I actually opposed both of the Iraq wars. I'm now willing to stand here today and say I was wrong about the first. I was absolutely right about the second. But this is not a repeat of 2003, where a preemptive strike is being led against a sovereign leader in a country, albeit an enemy. This is a situation where the sovereign government of a country is calling on nations of the rest of the world for their support and for their assistance, and Australia, as an international citizen, must answer that call. It also answers the call of the United Nations Secretary, Mr Ban Ki-moon, because many have said we should take this to the United Nations first. Well, I welcome the statement of the Secretary, Mr Ban Ki-moon, who has called on the international community to engage. He's pointed out that there are over 1.2 million displaced persons in the region. He's pointed out all of the atrocities that are going on, and he is calling on the international community to stand to, and indeed we should. Deputy Speaker, it is right for people in this place to be concerned about the possibility of mission creep. I share their concerns, but can I say, as a representative of my electorate, as a member of this parliament, we must be very mindful of our obligations to the international community and to our own community. In a world where you can jump on a plane in Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, Adelaide and many other places around the country and be in a theatre of war within 30 hours of departing our shores, and the opposite is also the case. We do not have the luxury of saying this is somebody else's problem happening somewhere else and we need not be involved. Deputy Speaker, it is not good enough for us in the wealthy countries of the world to say we give speeches and money while the poor people give their lives and give blood. We are better than that as a parliament. We are better than that as a people. I wholeheartedly support the actions of the government, the statement of the Leader of the Opposition, and I associate myself with the comments of the Shadow Foreign Affairs spokesman earlier in this place today. We cannot stand idly by.
I thank the member for that